She arrived in the city, with a lopsided smile, mud still crusted at the hem of her tiny sleeves, and a threadbare red ribbon braided into her hair. The bag she carried was larger than she was, seams bulging with clothes that smelled of smoke and river water, and the weight of it made her walk with a slight lean forward, determined as any ox in the market. People on the tram glanced, then looked away. The wealthy leaned past her. The rain made the pavement shine like a sheet of glass. No one expected a child to knock on the gate of the GU mansion and ask for work. She was 5 years old, and when the butler raised an eyebrow at her smallness, she straightened, set the bag down with both palms, and said, in a voice that had the quiet confidence of children who have had to be brave already, "I can teach him to be good." That, Lin, so absurd, so simple was the reason she was let in. Not because it was persuasive legalese, or a reference, because someone in that house, the old woman who watched from behind a carved screen, liked that kind of audacity. A tiny tutor, for the wild grandson, a bargain, shelter, a chance to learn, and pay small enough not to offend the household's delicacy. It was what Jinjing had asked for. Though the truth was, she had come to the city because, old Qi told her, the world outside the rice paddies had places where people could change the shape of their lives. Zhu Yifan, the grandson, met her in the nursery smelling of lemon oil and shoe polish. He was a boy who had never been denied anything he wanted, which meant he wanted to test the limits of the house and everyone in it. He was 8 older by 3 years, but not yet hardened by the sorts of choices wealth makes inevitable. His hair stuck up in small rebellions, his eyes were quick, searching for boredom and cruelty like a sparrow searches for crumbs. "You're not staying," he declared at once, the words sharpened by the way privilege can be a weapon. He pushed a tower of wooden blocks until it crashed and watched the stump of his power tremble. "Go back to your pack." She looked at the blocks, then at him. She did not tremble. "You can rebuild them," she said, "and I can show you a better way than breaking things." He blinked, as if she had suggested a magic trick. The first day, he shoved her, hard enough to make the edge of her small shoulder sting, but when she did not cry, only wiped the dirt from her sleeve, and picked up the blocks with the careful patience of someone who had learned to make good with not much. He found himself oddly halted. It was not that she spoke to him like the adults did. She spoke to him as if he were small and stubborn and human in a way the tutors had stopped being. She taught him quiet things. How to line up the blocks by size, how to fold paper cranes with the terrible gentleness of a sparrow, the names of the herbs in the little pot on the sill. He listened at first, because he liked having someone to trick. He listened longer, because she offered him no pity, and a kind of fierce straightforwardness he had not known existed. Word of the new tiny tutor spread among the children of the house the way gossip does in rooms that are too elegant for noise. Quickly, and with relish, some looked down their noses and called her names. Lin Jie, whose fingernails were always immaculate, and whose eyes measured everything as an investment, smiled small and said, "What use is a child as a teacher, especially for someone like Yifan?" Her voice was velvet, the plan behind it was not. But the first thing Jinjing taught Yifan was a trick that did not fit the nursery. Courage. On his 9th birthday, a party lit the terraces with paper lanterns, and the night hummed with servants pouring tea, and cousins laughing. Fireworks were scheduled, and the whole house was stupefied with prettiness. Yifan, in a fit of juvenile insistence, wanted to watch the rockets go off from the very top of the mansion, from the flat roof, where the city spread out like a map of lights. Guards forbade it. His mother refused. The old butler pretended not to hear. He rapped his knuckles on the railing of the stairs, and when Jinjing saw him stand there, she knew he would climb if there was no one to stop him. The boy's appetite for danger made him a magnet to petty thieves, who liked to ply their luck in the interstices of grand parties, men who could be bought for a quick loan or a loose promise. Someone in the dark had decided the birthday would be an opportunity. "You can't go up," she told him as he tugged at his sleeve. He looked at her with a look that had been carved from years of being indulged. "I will," he said. "I'll climb." So she climbed with him. The stairwell led out onto the roof, like a secret. The moon pulled silver from the tiles. Strings of lanterns were heavy in the air, casting warm pools of light. Yifan felt alive. He spread his arms, as if the city were a blank page. For a moment, the night belonged to him, and the small child who had followed him up a stair too high for her ankles. Then, the men appeared. They came soft as shadows at first, slipping up the back entrance from the alley, where the servants' quarters touched the sullen bricks. There were 3 of them cheap coats, the sort who sold themselves to the highest whisper. They thought the boy would scream when hands touched him. They did not know that a 5-year-old could be a small tornado. Zhengjing acted with the simple clarity that had gotten her out of the rice paddies and into the mansion. She saw the glint of a strap. She saw the way one of the men's fingers curled like a hook. She picked up a lantern and swung it not with strength but with intention. The glass struck a wrist. Startled cries broke out, and motion suddenly slowed the way time slows in the middle of things. Yifan, who had been poised on the edge of something showy and dangerous, found himself terrified and furious by turns. The rooftops, safety cracked like glass underfoot. "You run," she said, as if it were a plan they had practiced. He ran because she said so, not because she yanked him, or because he loved her, but because the command came from a place inside him that wanted to be better. They ducked behind a supply chest. The men cursed and stumbled. One of them lunged toward the safety ladder. Zhengjing threw something smaller. Handful of pebbles knocked from a jar. It hit the nearest man in the face, and he flailed. She grabbed Yifan's hand and they went down the stairs 2 at a time. The noise from the party above was a muffled ocean. They reached the service corridor, where the house smelled of fried garlic and warm linen, and the men were not far behind. A foot caught, a servant saw, and screamed. The thugs fled at the sound of voices and, most curiously, the weight of authority that comes on fast when adults gather. By the time Mrs. Jihold Madame Jilu arrived, breathless and furious, Zhengjing had knuckles scraped, and her ribbon untied. Yifan was standing straighter than he had in weeks. There was mud on his knees, and his eyes had a new softness to them, the kind that comes when someone has been saved, and remembers the taste of that saving. The matriarch looked at the small girl and at her grandson, and something like an ugly surprise crushed the old woman's face. "You let a child save my grandson," she said. No one in the house had expected the boy to stop needing someone to be managed. No one had expected a child like Zhengjing to have the nerve to throw pebbles at men twice her size. The story of the rooftop spread through the corridors with the speed of gasoline over embers. Servants admired her. Some of the tutors questioned whether children should be allowed to be brave and irresponsible at once. Lin, for the first time, Yifan looked at Zhengjing properly, not as a toy or a curiosity, but as a person who had deliberately put herself between him and danger. He never forgot how it felt to have someone else put your safety first. That small ledger of memory is where loyalty grows, and loyalty, unlike money, grows in a way that cannot be counted or charted. Stay until the end to see how a 5-year-old saves a family's name. You need to keep that thread in your head now. The beginning looks small, like a ribbon in hair, but it will pull and pull. Night turned into weeks, and the house settled into a new arrangement around the fact of the rescue. Zhengjing's presence became less of a joke, and more of a predicate. She was small and fearless. She had dirt under her nails, and would not be bribed with the candies the other children used to buy favors. She learned the names of the silver spoons, and the names of the servants who liked to listen to old songs. She learned when to be quiet and when to speak. And that made her dangerous in a way no one anticipated. She could speak plain truth in rooms built of politeness. That accuracy irritated Lin Jiajia, who saw in Zhengjing not an equal but a problem. Privilege, when asked to do anything other than preserve itself, tends to bristle. Jia had a plan. Subtle, surgical, and fit to the disciplines of the rich. She chose a vase. Not any vase, a blue porcelain antique that sat in the entrance hall like a slow, beautiful accusation. It had been passed down the family line for generations. It was worth more than several shops combined. During a small celebration when the house swelled with visitors, and Yefan was given the task of greeting them, a duty he performed with the small new courtesy learned on the rooftop. Someone shouted, and the vase crashed. Porcelain exploded into a constellation of white and blue. People recoiled. The butler bent to pick up the shards like a man who was collecting evidence. Lin Jigaya, with a sigh of coy horror, pointed toward the servant corridor where Zheng had been seen earlier. She was there, she said. She was underfoot. She cannot read the house, she has no respect for our things. It was an accusation dressed in civility. The servants' mouths went dry. Old Madame Jiu stood like a statue, hands curled around the edge of the banister. For every palace of privilege, there is a moment when it must decide whether to be merciful or to protect its face. Mercy smelled like risk. Dignity smelled like defense. Zheng had been carrying an apron full of herbs. She was on her way to fetch a balm for a servant with a cough when the crash sounded. She turned and saw the ruin of the vase, and the faces whirling. For a breath, she thought perhaps it had been an accident. The unfortunate collision of a running child and an expensive relic. For an even quicker breath, she saw Jia's look. The tight fold of someone who had planned a moment and was now enjoying the performance. Not me, Jingjin said simply. I wasn't there. Her voice was small. Not because she was afraid, but because she did not think size ought to come with spectacle. The servants murmured. Jia's smile hardened into a blade. Someone found a scrap of an embroidered handkerchief with dirt that smelled faintly of river mud. They showed it to the matriarch, as if it were a smoking gun. She comes from the country, Jia said, soft as silk. She does not understand the house. It is astonishing how quickly a household that had praised a child for bravery could decide her presence was unsightly. The matriarch's favor shifted like a weather vane. Her world was constructed of the preservation of reputation and the careful allocation of blame. A young girl from the paddies was a pebble that might upset the delicate balance. Zhengang's grandfather, Old Qi, came that week with a bag of steamed buns and a face like a folded letter. He watched the matriarch with the flat, patient sorrow of someone who has always lived at the margins of the important. She's a child, he told her, the tone of a man who believed in very small but crucial truths. Let her stay. But talk is a small thing against an accusation that fits too neatly into the walls of the house. Jingjing found herself called to the veranda, where the matriarch sat in a chair like an island, and the elders gathered like the tide. The words were careful. The suggestion was careful. The idea of guardianship and decorum, spun on a spindle of concern, pointed toward the gate. Yifan's face, which had learned a new sort of steadiness on the roof, broke into something like opposition. She saved me, he said. His voice had new authority because the boy who had been saved had the right, always, to speak for the one who saved him. She didn't break it. Family weight, pressed in. Gossip whispered like silk. Zheng sat with her small hands folded in her lap, and listened as the house debated her fate. It is strange to be judged in a room of elders, whose faces you do not fully understand. Stranger still, to be believed by the very person the house feared should be most spoiled. I will be careful, she said after a long time. I won't break anything else. It should have been an answer. It was not to everyone. The house had its own rituals. Proof, confession, the neat satisfaction of admitting wrongdoing. Jia, with the patience of someone playing a game, several moves ahead, left a new piece of evidence in the hands of a minor accountant. Later that afternoon, a receipt, a small, deliberate planting, that suggested a payment to a third party on the night of the vase. It was a thing of administrative cruelty, the kind that thrummed with the precise love the privileged have for tidy justifications. Jinjing did not know how to argue with receipts. She understood mud, and herbs, and the smell of river. She understood the weight of a grandfather's hand on her shoulder. She knew that honor was worth risking for, because Old Key had told her it was the only thing you could carry that would not rust or rot. That evening, as rain returned and beat soft on the eaves, she sat on the back steps and unbraided her ribbon, smoothing the small wooden charm at its end between her fingers. The charm was carved by Old Key 3 tiny waves, and a hand. "Remember where you come from," he had told her. "There is a strength there, use it." Strength, in Jingen's life, came in small acts. The right word, at the right moment. A knowledge of which leaves to boil for a fever. A refusal to be cowed. But the house was a larger thing. And sometimes, strength needed allies. Meanwhile, in a glass tower not far from the mansion, someone watched the household, with a ledger open and confidence, like a blade. Chairman Huo had his own reasons to be interested in the Jiyu family. Alliances, the slow chess of business, and the tendency of rich men's enemies to become useful. Hubo Shufang, his son, had heard about the rooftop rescue whispered over tea. The story of a 5-year-old standing between thugs and a Jiyu heir was the sort of anecdote that commanded attention in rooms where influence was a kind of currency. Jinjing had not yet met the Huo family. The first contact came through a man in a gray suit who arrived at dawn. Hukurida. Small thing, almost ridiculous against his expensive quota note. From Chairman Huo. He spoke to the matriarch about alliances and stability. He watched Jingjing with a soft curiosity, as if he were measuring the potential in a strange plant. When he left, a single card remained on the matriarch's coffee table. It had Huo's emblem stamped in the corner. For Zhenjiang, the arrival of the Huo emissary was a thin thread of possibility. She did not know what he could do. She only knew that sometimes allies arrive wearing suits, and sometimes they arrive wearing old shoes. Both kinds can change the shape of a life. Days after the vase, the house did what houses of discretion do best. It held its breath. The matriarch delayed the final decision. She appointed a small inquiry, a low tribunal that would look at receipts and testimonies. People in the house began to pair off in their loyalties. Yifan shadowed to Jinjing at every turn now, awkwardly protective as if that were a new kind of armor he had apprenticed under. Lin Jijia, furious at the cooling of her advantage after the rooftop, began visiting the accountants more often, smiling with teeth that always knew how to ask favors. Then a new thing happened, small and precise. Zheng Zhang discovered a page tucked in the back of a ledger, placed near the old woman's reading chair. It was a sheet of paper folded many times, soft at the creases. She had been dusting, and the edge had drifted like a leaf. She picked it up with her thumb, and it smelled faintly of camphor and smoked the scent of things preserved. The paper bore handwriting that was not the matriarch's. It was slanted and hurried and belonged to someone who had had to write in secret. There were names, a faint stamp, and a sequence of numbers. A name repeated itself, like a stubborn echo. Gu. Xingguan. There were also references to transfers, and a line that made Jingjing's stomach fall. If the ledger is lifted, use the ledger mapper in the copy. False trails? Zheng's men to be paid in 3 days? It was a thing that fit the appetite of an investigator. A small contradiction, a hint that someone had been moving money under the table. Zhen Zheng had not learned to read complex receipts in the fields. But she had learned to read motives. When someone wrote burn a copy, there were secrets worth burning. That night, she carried the paper under her pillow, and listened to the house breathe. Ulki left at dawn, worried more than he said. Jing Zheng kept the page, as if it were a raw herb she needed to dry. She did not yet understand the scope of what she had found. She only understood that it was not meant for her eyes, and that it smelled of danger. Rumor moves in circles, and conspiracies move in layers. Before she could show the paper to anyone, someone else in the house noticed a different pattern. A young guard, who had been tender to the courtyard dogs, reported that he had seen a delivery man in a dark coat pass under the servants' windows on the night the vase broke. His memory was the sort of thing that was often dismissed, yet when he mentioned the time and the direction, the matriarch's eyes narrowed. That day, someone found an electronic receipt for a small, suspicious transfer to a shell company. It was little enough to be overlooked, and large enough to be meaningful. The numbers lined up like a neat argument. Accusations can suffocate a life. Proof can exhale a doubt. The house bent towards the latter, because the matriarch had learned in her long life that the truth, when presented cold and clear, was a medicine or a guillotine. Either way, it was efficient. Jinjing, who had been promised nothing and given shelter, felt the tightening of the house like a throat closing. She went to Yifan that night, and placed the folded paper in his small hands, not telling him to do anything, only handing it over like a trust. He looked at the scribble as if it were a treasure map, and then at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "In the chair where she reads," she said. "It fell. It had to have fallen there for a reason." He sat up, suddenly serious in a way that made her think again of the rooftop. "We should tell Grandma," he said. "She will know what to do." Old Madame Zhu read the paper with hands that had steadied many storms. Her face did not move much. It was a lake with only occasional ripples. When she was finished, she folded it back carefully, as if she were tucking in an animal that might bite if handled roughly. "This is dangerous," she said. "Danger is the shape of consequence." When the matriarch said it, the servant's eyes widened. Jejea's expression, in the doorway, did not widen at all. There was a plan within planning. The house smelled of rain and the lingering aroma of the herbs Jinging had brought. "You should not keep things like this," the matriarch told Zhenjiang, "if they think you had anything to do with it." "I didn't," Zhenjiang said. The words were small, but she had a clear conviction in them. "I found it." Ye Fun wrapped a blanket over both of their knees. "We won't let them take her away. But the house is not won by the will of two children. It is negotiated by whispers and receipts and favors." Someone who noticed the way Yifan now looked at Jingjiang told Lin Jiejie, who smiled the smile of someone with momentum. Someone else, less careful, was overheard in the kitchen, bragging about seeing a man in a dark coat. In observation, Jiejie used to weave a story that fit the vase smoothly into a larger pattern. A country girl, loose in the house. The house must protect itself. What followed was the slow, bureaucratic tightening of a net. Interviews, questions asked with civility, but with an edge. A request that Ginjing leave the house for the protection of the child and offer of a modest severance and safe passage home. The butler used words like precedent and harmony. The matriarch pretended to consult. Yifan, who had been learning responsibility as one might learn to walk a tightrope, refused to hand Jinjiang over. "You saved me," he told the elders. "She is staying." "It's complicated," the matriarch said. "She's not yet proven innocent." "You don't prove innocence by sending away someone who has nothing to protect them," Jinjing said, mouth steady. Her voice trembled for a second, but she held on. "If you want to know who did this, look at the money." They glanced at the matriarch. They would, slowly, because the matriarch had once been a woman who could move mountains with an eyebrow. Yet even as arguments curled in corridors and receipts were printed and copied, a darker thread tightened outside the house. The men who had tried the rooftop once were not simple thieves. They worked in patterns. A message was sent to the wrong number. A note that said, simply, "Move the girl or the next one will not be a scare." It was the kind of note that costs nothing to write and a lot to be on the receiving end of. When Jingjing found it, folded and placed beneath the bowl of rice on the kitchen counter, as if it had been a joke left for the cooks, she read the line and felt something like ice run down her spine. She was 5 years old, and the world was telling her she needed to be careful enough to belong to it. She held the paper and the wooden charm she had been given, and thought of Old Key's hands, thick and sure, and of her village river that kept moving no matter what happened on its banks. "My grandfather will come," she told the matriarch that night. "He can help. He knows people." But Old Key, when he came back, wore worry like a coat. He had been accosted on the road by a man who liked to ask where family loyalties lay, by men who had the smoothness of hired calculation. They asked about the Jiyu family, he told Jingjing, in the small dark of the servants' quarters. They asked if the girl was safe. I said, I did not know. They do not like being told no. The next morning, a car with dark windows rolled slowly past the front gate, and the driver watched 4 faces at breakfast tables. Chairman Huo's card lay on the matriarch's coffee table, and in the house, alliances shifted like furniture during an earthquake. Jingjing realized she could not merely wait. She had found a paper that smelled of danger. Seen the look in Jiajia's eyes, felt the house tilt. If the ledger suggested a frame, then the frame had architects. She would need more than courage. She would need someone with channels and muscle. She was a child, small and loud and thin. She also had a stubbornness inherited from years of absence, wanting to be less than everything. That afternoon she slipped into the servants' quarters, and sat with the kitchen manager, an old woman who knew the schedule of every person in the house. "Who comes from where?" Jingjing asked. "Who sold their loyalty?" The woman's eyes were all mended with experience. "People make business with people who have money," she said. "But sometimes, money is a trick." "Then, who would make that trick?" she dash. Zen dash. Persisted. "They used to come at night," the woman said slowly. "A man with a limp. A young fellow in a captain's coat. They spoke with a voice like paper being cut." The words were immediate, as if the woman had once been a poet, and now had become an archivist of people's habits. They liked to ask about ledgers. Small clues became a map. Jingjing tucked them one by one into her pocket like birds. She would not be a detective. In a way the world recognized, she would be one through the accumulation of small truths. She pulled the page from behind the matriarch's book out again and traced the handwriting with her finger. The name Zhang was faint. Someone must have written it as a warning. Zhang's family, to be whispered of in the right rooms, had teeth. The wheels of conspiracy turn slowly, but once they have started, they turn with hunger. Lin Jiajia moved with the terrible grace of a predator who knows the exact day to strike. She gathered a few allies, including a young secretary with an easy smile, and planted a note in a ledger. She made sure, through a set of small assassinations into the house's records, that suspicion would find its way to the smallest person who could least defend themselves. When the matriarch's inquiry convened, Jingjing sat with her hands folded, and listened as men spoke in numbers, and lawyers spoke in diction. Yufan's small hand found hers under the table. He did not let go. "You have to be brave," he whispered into her ear like a vow. "I will be brave, for both of us." She squeezed his fingers. A child's courage is simple. Do the right thing, because someone you care for needs you. But the world outside is not simple, and politics live in hands that can sign away lives. Just before the inquiry's conclusion, the matriarch announced a brief reprieve. The girl would not be expelled that day. It was a mercy, wrapped in calculation. Old Madame Zhu had her reasons as to. Most old women, who have survived long, and carried regret like a shawl. She wanted to see more proof. She wanted to keep her grandson out of scandal. She wanted, perhaps, to control the damage. That night, when the house had receded into sleep, Lin Jiajia stood at her window with a glass of wine and the faint, satisfied smile of someone who had placed her chess piece correctly. She had not yet One no plan is ever foolproof, but she had tilted the board. Elsewhere, in a dim warehouse, beyond the city's polite distance, men spoke of payments and timing, and the soft, efficient lines of a plot being pushed forward. Genjing did not know all of that. She only knew the tightness of the paper in her pocket, and the acoustics of a house that could close an eye. She had a page that smelled of camphor, and a wooden charm in her hair. She had Yifan, who had once been wild, and was now something different. Someone who would stand. She had Old Key, who had a face like an old coin. She also had the knowledge that danger was learning to slide into the house like mist. The next move would demand more than a child could do on her own. It would require alliances and proofs, and the means to lift a name from mud. As dawn broke the next day and the city was rinsed clean by rain, a car with tinted windows slowed in front of the GU gate. It was not the Huo's car. It was smaller, meaner, and it parked where a visitor's car should not have. A man in a dark coat stepped out and paused by the servant's entrance, as if to test who noticed. Then he walked into Saitu, purposeful, to calm. Genjing saw him from the corner of the kitchen, where she was gathering the herbs she had brought that morning. Her fingers stopped on a sprig of mugwort, and she felt the same small tightness in her chest she had felt when the men first climbed the stair to the roof. She tucked the herb into her apron and walked toward the back door, carrying not just plant medicine but the insistence that some things must be asked about. The man's eyes found hers and held. He offered a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, in that voice, like an invoice, "Little one, who pays you to be brave?" It was the sort of question designed to be funny and dangerous at once. Jin could have run. Instead, she looked at him with the slow confidence children use when they have had to be honest more than once in a life. "Nobody pays me," she said. "I do it because someone needed it." The man's smile shifted. "And if someone wanted you to stop?" he asked. Her mouth hardened with a small, stubborn line. She had learned by watching Old Key's hands knit and unknot themselves. "Then, I wouldn't," she said. He laughed, a noise like a coin falling into a well, and walked away. The house watched. The kitchen manager muttered a prayer for those who stay where storms form. That afternoon, a messenger from Chairman Hua arrived at the mansion with a card and a calm, measured tone. He asked for an audience with the matriarch. When he was led into the drawing room, he spoke of balance and the cost of scandal. He left with a promise. He would keep an eye. He was not the Huo family yet, but the fact a Huo emissary had shown his card at the matriarch's table sent a ripple through the house. For Jinjin, the presence of the Huo card felt like a possible lifeline. She did not yet realize that ties with power were as risky as they were useful. She only knew that sometimes people with resources could afford to ask questions others could not. If she were to clear Ju Chengguan's name, if she were to unmask the architects of the frame, she would need someone with channels, with money, with the sort of influence that made men who laughed in wells think twice. Night tightened its cloak over the mansion as plans, small and large, began to unfurl. Genjing sat at the edge of her bed, clutching the page she had found, and listening to the house breathe. Outside, a pair of headlights paused at the gate, and a muffled voice spoke to the security guard about deliveries. Inside, the matriarch poured herself a single cup of tea, and considered the lines of her family. Like a woman who had always known consequence, Genjing slept fitfully, as if the small wooden charm in her hair had suddenly become a compass. The next day would bring more questions. It would bring formal inquiries, and perhaps a person from the Hua family, who might be a friend. It would bring men who wore smiles like knives. It might bring a threat made plain. But for the first time since she had climbed off the tram with mud at her cuffs, Jingjing understood, with the clarity of a child who has been given a map, that the thing dumb, beloved that thing that had been, nothing more than saving a child from a rooftop had become an ember in an engine. The house was not merely a building, it was a machine of ties and debts, and someone had thrown a stone into its gears. She folded the paper once more, smoothed it like a promise, and tucked it beneath the wooden charm at her throat. Tomorrow, she decided, they would do more than wait. She would ask the Huel's emissary for an audience. She would show the matriarch the piece of paper, and demand that truth be sought. She was 5 years old, small enough to be overlooked and stubborn enough to be remembered. Outside, the rain stopped, and the city washed itself clean again. Inside, men in suits, who watched the house from afar, exchanged messages like chess moves. In the kitchen, a cook hummed a tune under her breath. On the roof, the spot where the lanterns had hung was empty now, but its memory had been rewritten. A shadow moved behind a curtain, and left a folded note in the matriarch's cane chair. It was small enough to be missed among 100 other things, but Jingjing found it while polishing the low table that afternoon. The note had only 2 words, and they read like an invitation. Meet at midnight. She felt her chest go cold and then hot in quick succession. The world of old women and ledgers and kitchen murmurs had, by the placement of that note, become a place where someone was asking for help. The word midnight suggested secrets, and secrets suggested danger. But also, perhaps, a clue. She wrapped her small hands around the paper and the wooden charm and thought of the man with a limp, the captain's coat, the note tucked beneath the rice, the blue and white porcelain raining into shards. She thought, sharply, of the Huo emblem resting on the matriarch's table. Somewhere beyond the polite rooms of the house, a machinery of betrayal turned. At midnight, when the house slept and lanterns threw narrow moons on the corridor, Jinjin slipped out of bed with the quiet purpose of someone who has practiced climbing for weeks. Yifan was already awake, his face a line of resolve and worry. "You don't have to go alone," he said. She smiled. The smile was small and steady. "I don't plan to." They met at the back stair, the page secreted in her pocket. The corridor smelled like lemon oil and old paper. The matriarch's cane chair sat empty, a small darkness in the room. They moved like conspirators, to children in the corridors of a house that had been the scene of both comfort and suspicion. At the 7th gate, the world outside was no longer safe from the sort of men who sold their loyalty. A delivery van idled where it should not. The hum of the city was like a distant ocean. At the threshold of the house, a figure waited in the shadows, a silhouette of a man with a limp, and the ghost of a captain's coat. He extended a hand, and in it lay a small envelope. He spoke in a voice that had once been like paper being cut. "I was told you would come," he said. Jinjing stepped forward, her wooden charm at her throat like a tiny banner. She had begun as a child who wanted only to be useful, and had become, without meaning to, the key to the house's future. The man smiled, the smile of someone who knew the price of things. "We have much to discuss," he said. In the kitchen, a pot simmered, and the cook hummed. In the bedroom, Oldaki mumbled into his pillow. In the drawing room, the Huo card waited like a quiet promise. And somewhere in the city, people who liked to watch folded their hands and wait for trouble. The way gulls wait for fishermen to throw a catch. The man with the limp did not ask for names. He moved like someone who had spent his life making sure most people never saw the full length of his plan. He slid the envelope into Yifan's small palm, as if it were an ordinary thing, and not the hinge of a door. The paper inside held a single line and an address, a time, and the kind of shorthand that meant someone expected discretion. There was also a faint stamp in the corner, a symbol that Yifan had seen once on a delivery manifest and then forgotten. "You shouldn't be here," the man said softly, and for a second the knight seemed to agree. "This is not a place for children to be curious." Jingjing had the odd mixture of stubbornness and quick judgment that made her all the sharper for danger. She folded her lips in the way she did when she was thinking of Old Key's hands and the river he had loved. "We want to know who broke the vase," she said plainly. The man's laugh was low. "Some things are broken because someone wants them to be. You will learn." He left as quietly as he had come. Yifan tucked the envelope beneath his shirt and promised, shaky but earnest, that he would go with her if she asked him. There was bravery in that promise that felt like armor. They slept little that night. The house seemed to breathe with them. Even the cats moved like sentinels. When morning came, they prepared. Jinjin hid the page she had found again in her small bundle of belongings and tucked a sprig of mugwort into the lining of her jacket. The smell close to her skin like an old friend. She felt, for the first time, the full contour of the choice she had made. To step into a space where the stakes were measured, not in bandages or scolding, but in reputations and livelihoods. They followed the address to a narrow street of warehouses at the edge of the city, where the glass towers threw long shadows and the wind smelled of oil and old paper. The building at the number given had the kind of anonymity that people bought with money. It could have been a folding factory, a storage unit, or the front, for a business that had no business length enough to be checked. Lights burned in one window. They watched from the shadow of a shutter and saw a man leave, his jacket dusted with the kind of grit that comes from driving between deals. He walked down the slabbed pavement and climbed into a van that idled too patiently in the road. Jinjin felt her heart beat like a small drum against her ribs. Yifan's fingers were cold in hers, but steady. They did not have the right to launch into a warehouse blind. They were children with thin pockets and thicker courage, so they watched. A delivery truck came. Men unloaded crates, and a tall person in a gray coat with a limp came and spoke softly with one of the drivers. Jingjin made the small connection she had learned to make in the fields. Movement in and out equals exchange. Exchange could mean goods or payment. They needed proof, not just hunches. Jinjing remembered the scrap of embroidered handkerchief, and the electronic receipt, and the hush of the servants' whispers. Proof could be a photograph, a name, a ledger entry, something that would stand up under the scrutinies adults liked to perform. She had to give the Huel family something solid to use if they were to risk their name. She and Yifan crept around the back of the warehouse when the street felt clear. There was a side door, bolted but with cheap hinges. Zheng, who had learned to slide through hedgerows and muddy fences, had the kind of hands that could find a weakness. They slipped inside through a slit of cracked wood, and found themselves in a hall that smelled of oil and dust, and the faint trace of camphor, the same fragrance that had sat on the paper tucked under old Madame Jiu's book. Boxers stacked to the rafters. A clipboard lay near a crate. A pen had been left uncapped, ink drying like a small puddle. At the end of the aisle, a light swung, and a shadow moved. The two children dove behind a crate as footsteps came close. Heavy boots. Careful breathing. Jinjing flattened herself against the wood. Her heart thudded with the same cadence she had felt on the rooftop, but with a new layer of calculation. This time, she was hunting evidence. A guard unlocked the chest and pulled out envelopes. He spread them on a table and began to write receipts. His hands were steady, practiced in the art of making things look routine. One of the envelopes bore the name of a shell company. Ging had seen on the small receipt planted earlier numbers that had matched the transfer out of a GU account. She saw the name Zhang Group scrawled in a hurried hand across one envelope. Her throat went dry. She moved without thinking. It was not a hero's dramatic leap. It was the soft, urgent motion of someone who had always learned to get what she needed quietly. She slipped from behind the crate and pretended to be a worker looking for lost tools. The guard looked up, suspicious, but she smiled and credited the old habit of small talk. "We've been given permission to check inventory," she said, borrowing the language of workers who had to explain themselves. That lie might have worked if not for a second guard who had the reflexes of a man who had watched too many small lies get large. He stepped forward, his hand sliding toward his belt. Yifan, who had never been trained to fake passivity, stood too close and knocked over a stack of boxers by accident. Sound exploded in the silence. Footsteps raced. She ran first, because her legs knew the beat of river currents, and because 3 steps never felt safer than the 4th. Yifan followed, smaller and less steady, but with a furious protection that had been growing in him since the rooftop. They burst out into the alley and the cool night air, and the van's engine started faster than they had hoped. A chase followed that felt like a dream made of gravel and breathing. Men in coats ran after them, the city singing in a dozen different accents. They ducked through a gap between warehouses, leapt over a low chain, and finally found cover inside a cooling shed where steam hissed and pipes traced the roof like veins. There, panting and mud-splattered, Zhenjing pushed the envelope she had taken into Yifan's hands. He opened it. Inside was a list of payments, dates, and names of little pieces of a machine. One name had been circled: Suling. Another line had the bank code. Zhenjing recognized from the electronic receipt they had seen on the matriarch's table. There was also a scrawled note, in a hurry: burn copies. If anyone asks, it was a misdelivery. It was, in the language of conspiracies, a confession laid out in ink. They also found a smaller paper folded inside, like a secret, kept deliberately. It held a photograph of a meeting. A man with a limp, the young captain's coat, and a figure whose face was turned, but whose posture betrayed statusa. Person who wore shoes too clean for the docks, the sort who could afford to hide in plain sight. Added to this, there were delivery manifests with times that lined up exactly with the night the vase had broken. They had names, dates, and the numerical threads that could tie Jiajia's staged evidence to the Zhang family's network. This is it, Yifan breathed. He was young, but he understood the weight of paper. The photograph was a key. The manifests were doors. We show this to Grandma. Zhenjing wanted to, more than anything, but she had learned caution. The men who had followed them could return at any time, and they had no adults to stand between them and the worst of consequences. She thought of old Key's face, of the Huo card, of the way the matriarch's hall had felt both frightening and protective. They took the envelope and the photograph home, and hid them beneath a loose floorboard. In Zhengjing's small room, they washed the grit from their clothes and, for the first time in days, allowed themselves the relief of quiet and cleaning. Yifan's eyes were bright with feverish clarity. He had, overnight, become someone who realized his words might actually move the course of events. The matriarch listened when they spoke. She did not smile. She had never smiled easy about accusation. Yet she had also spent a life, knowing how the world could be bought and sold. She called a quiet meeting with Huo's emissary the next day, and Huo Sheiyufan himself came under the guise of inspecting mutual investments and possible alliances. Chairman Huo's presence changed the tenor of the house, like a gust through an enclosed room. He was not a man who wasted words. He was a man who used them sparingly and with precise aim. The photograph and the manifests were presented to him in a cautious meeting that included old Madame Ji, Yifan, and Zhenjing. Though the girl sat at the very edge of the table like an ember someone might snuff or feed, Huo Xiufeng's expression did not change. He thumbed the edges of the manifest, as if testing paper for truth. He asked questions that were practical. Who had access to the manifests? Which banks were involved? Who signed off? Each one a probe designed to trace money? The way a farmer traces irrigation lines? You have more? He asked finally. Zhenjing, who had no adult polish, and therefore spoke without pretense, took a breath and told him about the paper she had found in the matriarch's chair, and about the man with the limp who had left the note. She told him how the men took advantage of a party and how the vase had conveniently shattered at a time when Jiajia could point and look like an offended party. Huo's face hardened into a map of decisions. You did well, he said quietly. And that was perhaps the most dangerous praise she had yet received. It was praise that might make her a target, and also a person worth protecting. He did not act like a hero. He arranged for evidence to be photographed and catalogued by professionals, rather than children. He tapped into Channel's quiet calls, made that moved people who kept phone lines in their pockets. He asked the matriarch to let him handle the investigation with discretion. "We will not make a spectacle," he told them, "but we will gather what is necessary." To Jingzhen, discretion meant more than the absence of fanfare. It meant that powerful people could afford to be methodical, and methodical moves, when they were about truth, could be decisive. They began, piece by piece, to build a case. CCTV footage from a nearby shop showed a van pulled at the time the manifest indicated. The van's license plate matched a number in a registry that the Huo emissary, with the proper nudge, could access. Bank records were subpoenaed under the guise of a business audit. Transactions that had once been buried were laid bare in black and white. Each time a paper emerged, it was crossed, a pattern formed. But conspiracies have guards, and the Zhang family had enough teeth to make men wary. The first attempt to prevent the case from moving forward came not with guns but with a softer poison. A whisper campaign, paid witnesses, and small threats, like the one tucked beneath the rice bowl. Zhen Jiang, who had only ever walked the fields' thin roads, and the mansion's narrower ones, felt the pressure like a tide. The poison attempt came in the form of a tea. A board meeting had been arranged, at which the matriarch was to show proof to a small group of elders and a few company executives. By design, the meeting was intimate. The tea service was brought in with all the pomp a family could conjure to show the world they wore dignity like armor. A servant new to the Hausa replacement who had slipped in under the radar poured the tea. His hands shaking, Zhenging noticed the new servant's fingers tremble, and the slight metallic glint at the edge of his sleeve an odd gleam on an otherwise ordinary day. She knew, by smelling the way the air tightened, that something could be wrong. Her knowledge of herbs was not merely quaint, she had learned the bitter scent of aconite, and the chalk of certain poisons in the fields where neighbors took tumble and lives were saved by quick hands and boiled roots. Her hands, small and sure, reached into the cloth she carried and she grabbed a sprig of boiled mugwort, the bitter aroma cutting the sweetness in the room. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She asked for a cup, as if she wanted to taste and show how the flavor should be. The matriarch, already on edge from the recent revelations, watched her with a suspicion sharpened into curiosity. Jinjin dipped the mugwort into the spill, and asked the servant to taste. "Are you nervous?" she asked, with the indifference of someone buying time. The servant took the cup. He coughed, and his face went pale. He sputtered that it tasted wrong and reached for a glass of water. A doctor was called to us. Man had already arranged for a physician to be within earshot, and the quick tests that could be done without alarms showed traces of a bitter alkaloid. The meeting postponed itself with the gentlemanly clumsiness of people who were trying to be careful, but also wanted to move forward. A servant was taken aside and questioned gently. Under pressure, the man confessed that he had been approached and paid to tamper with the matriarch's tea. He named a handler who drove a gray van with a plate that matched the one on file. It was not the full architecture of the conspiracy, but it was another threaded piece. The poisoning had been meant to be a quiet way of bending the house's will. Instead it became proof of the attempt and the reach of those behind it. Hua's people moved with legal caution. They did not rust. They did the next best thing. They sealed records and began quietly to reposition assets and alliances in a way that would make it harder for the Jiang network to operate without a referendum of proof. The small victories were bureaucratic and therefore durable. They made men and women who worked in the buzzing world of numbers uncomfortable. It is a rare thing to make numbers nervous, and when they shivered, it meant the fabric of a conspiracy was loosening. But a conspiracy does not relax because you name it. It reacts. Linjia Jaya, pressed, made a choice. She chose to push her advantages in the one place she thought the house could not ignore: the public stage. A gala was planned not by coincidence, the pretense of a charitable event, hosted by the Jehu family, to celebrate a year of philanthropic work. The house was polished, the lights demanded punctuality, and the chandeliers sparkled like an invitation to forget. Jia, who had the careful face of someone accustomed to gathering the right allies, arranged for a speech. It would be perfunctory. It would be a moment that, if she could sculpt it properly, would drown the whisper of accusations and applause. What she had not counted on was the Huo family's patience. Huo Xiaofeng arrived with a presence that was a warning. He wore fewer jewels, but he carried men who knew to stand at the ready. He sat in the front row and watched. The matriarch spoke with the exact weight of someone who had lived a long life and wanted to choose her family's terms. Jinjing sat near the back, a small figure in a sea of silks, her hair tied with a new ribbon that old Qi had mended for her, the wooden charm against her chest, like an anchor. Jia stood to speak, and her voice sputtered through the air. She meant to spin the event into a victory, to point to the house's willingness to forgive itself and move forward. She made her gestures, and then, with the carefully planted smile of a practiced manipulator, she reached into her purse and produced a copy of a ledger. In times of confusion, she said, voice laced to be both sad and righteous, we must protect our heritage. This ledger shows irregularities, connections that suggest mismanagement. Her eyes slid toward the matriarch with a stab of polite accusation. If the family would rather protect those who are small and inexperienced, rather than pursue truth, then perhaps we must consider the company's reputation. There was a hush designed to make the matriarch look weak if she did not react. Jia's plan was to make the house polarize, forcing the matriarch into a corner where her choices would look like favors. Huo Shahu. Huo Shahu. Thua Shahu. Huo Shahu. Feng. Stud. Feng. Thuer Moor. Thuer Lili. Thuer Len. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the podium and, with a simple tone, asked the event's sound engineer to play a recording. A murmur rose. Why would he will ask for a recording? The engineer played a short clip. The voices of men speaking in the warehouse, voices that had been recorded by a discreet device Huo's people had put on the van's dashboard when they trailed it for days. The voices spoke of payments and quoted the ledger Jia had used, corroborating the signatories. They mentioned a delivery time, a van, and a code that matched the manifest. The room tilted. Jia's face, which had been the practiced face of composure, flickered. Her allies stifled coughs. The matriarch's eyes hardened into a slow, old kind of justice. It was not the final fall of the house's enemies, but it was the unraveling of one stitch. Huo Shaifeng had not sought to humiliate. He had sought to expose, and exposure in the light of a gala was a potent weapon. Men whispered. Phones exchanged messages. The security bureau, prompted by a call placed quietly from the Huo office, moved in. Arrests were not cinematic. They were efficient and plain. Men were taken for questioning. Assets were temporarily frozen. Su Ling's name had surfaced in the manifests, and in the ledger. She found herself summoned by people who asked her about bank transfers and vendor lists. Under the quiet pressure of investigation, some conspirators slipped into a web they had not planned for. A young secretary who had once smiled in hallways and carried keys found himself offering names in exchange for leniency. One captured thug, the sort who thought he knew how loyalty bought safety, cracked when confronted with a photograph and a bank statement. He had expected threats to be enough, but Huo's team had given him little option. Confess, cooperate, or face charges that might never leave his children untouched. He sighed and told of deliveries and payments, of times and people, and he named the Zhang family and a middleman who had worked directly with Lin Jie. The man with the limp, it turned out, had been a hired contact for the Zhangs 4 years in. Intermediary the family used when they wished to move things without getting their own hands dirty. With each confession, the net tightened. Evidence that had once been a rumor became a documented trail: photographs, ledger entries, delivery manifests, and witness statements. The matriarch, who had been cautious because she had feared ruin, now found herself with a path toward true vindication. The papers found earlier in the chair that had smelled of camphor were not simply odd scraps. They were drafts of a caveat note that Mr. Jia had written months before, a plan describing how he had been offered bribes by a rival to sign away a contract and how he had refused, and hidden evidence in case something went wrong. Mr. Jiu's handwriting, verified by an old stamp in the company's safe, matched the careful slant of a man who had once been betrayed. The final knot came when a ledger found in a safe deposit, one that old Madame Jiu had kept under her special key. Unsealed, it contained a letter Mr. Jiu had addressed to his wife before a trip, a short paragraph that included numbers, and a directive to keep certain documents secret until truth returned. The letter's tone was personal and heavy. A man describing his own fear that he could be framed, asking his wife to guard his good name if he could not. "This is enough," old Madame Jiu said once, and when she spoke like that, the house listened. She arranged for the presentation of these documents to be formal and binding, a transfer of evidence directly to investigators, a public declaration that the Jiu family would not shield anyone who had broken the loan, that they would also pursue appeal for the wrongs done to Mr. Jiu. The courtroom of public opinion is quick and shrewd. The Security Bureau called a press conference and presented the chain of evidence. There it was. The van's registration, the delivery manifests, the bank transfers, the witness statements, and the letter from Mr. Jiu. Names were read aloud. Lin Jiajia's role was placed next to financial records and a signed receipt from her nominal ally at the Zhang family. Su Ling's name, Su Mei Mei's, in some versions, appeared beside a transfer linked to a shell company. The Zhang family's involvement was no longer a whisper in holes. It was an accusation carried in paper. Jiajia crumbled the way brittle things do. She tried to point fingers, to say the documents were forged, that the Huo family had orchestrated a smear. But when men's words are backed by cameras and numbers, and the reluctant testimony of a henchman, counter-narratives thin to raggedness. The matriarch's decision to hand evidence to the Bureau had been the correct one in this age. Transparency with solid proof drew a public right of reckoning. Mr. Jiu's name was cleared. It was not an instant washing of grime, but a formal legal reversal and public apology that reassembled edge by edge what had been The Jiu patriarch returned to his old dignity slowly, like a man who needed to relearn the shape of his life after it had been bent. Old Madame Jiu, who had weathered the entire storm, allowed herself a private moment of relief that was not theatrical, but entirely human. For Zhengjing, the winds felt both large and small. She had been a small hand on a ledger that had become a leva. The house repaired itself around the truth. She was praised, but not with flattery that would make her naive. Huo Xiaofeng offered quiet counsel. There would be schooling opportunities, connections for old Qi, and a suggestion that Zhenshang might be given a stipend, and access to learning the sorts of skills that could keep her safe, and make her useful in the future. The matriarch insisted on the last. Some education, a modest fund for clothes and books, and the promise that Zhang would be a permanent member of the household. Until adulthood. Years are patient things. They do quietly the work of changing people in ways that a single victory cannot do. Jing grew with an access she had never imagined. She was taught reading beyond invoices. She sat in small classes Huo's foundations provided, and learned to write reports and track paper. She learned to move in rooms of power without shrinking from them. The wooden charm remained at her throat, though it was mended and repolished, and its wave had been darkened by the smoke of lanterns and the dust of warehouses. Ethan grew too. He was not only the boy who had been saved, he became the young man who chose to lead by example. He deferred to counsel, he learned numbers, he listened to workers at factories, and to the small men who policed the alleys that fed the city. The rooftop bravery that had first shaped him became a quiet backbone. He was more careful with his words, and more ready to stand when his family was threatened. Time did what time does best. It smoothed the jagged edges, and left behind a sculpture that looked like maturity. Jing went away for a season to study with Huo's sponsorship, learning management and subtleties of negotiation and law that had once read to her like an ocean of strange words. She returned with a steady gait and the firmness of someone who had been sharpened by learning. Old Ki watched her with a softness that had lines of pride in it he had never before permitted himself to display. The matriarch softened too. Though she never lost her capacity for cautiousness, she became a grandmother who had once feared to lose the family name, and now she loved the child who had saved it, as if she had been the one to gift her a second chance. For Lin Jiejia and her conspirators, justice had consequences. Some were charged, others forced to resign into exile of riches, but without influence. The Zhang family found that even teeth could age and be pulled. The house was repaired not by denial, but by cleaning. Family members who had once been ashamed of admitting error began to speak about the cost of greed. The guards at the gate changed their watchmen. Security tightened in ways that were not humiliation but prudence. Then the time skip came, not as an abrupt cut, but as a montage of small moments stitched into a large one. Jing, no longer a 5-year-old, with mud on her cuffs, walked the halls with a composure that had steadied into something very like authority. She carried a satchel, now leather, chosen and polished, and inside were documents and a little book of notes, written in her careful hand. She had grown into someone who could manage both a ledger and the affection of a family. The wooden charm remained tied faintly to a ribbon that she sometimes braided into her hair, sometimes tucked beneath her collar. Zhu Yifan, who had been wild and charmed into being better by the small tutor who had once saved him, carried the imprint of that rescue like a map. He rose in the company, gradually taking on roles and responsibilities that required the steadiness he had learned. When his father chose him to be a vice president, it was not solely because of blood, but because Yifan had learned to measure the consequences of his decisions against the well-being of workers and the health of the company. He had also learned, more quietly, to ask for advice, and to keep promises when the opportunity to break them was tempting. His relationship with Jing had become one of steadfastness and mutual respect, long before anything more came to pass. They stood together at the edge of a new season, when the house held a smaller, quieter ceremony, a vow to keep the family office transparent, a formal public apology to those wronged, and the promise to support programs for small villages, like the one Zhenjiang had come from. The matriarch, who had once seen the world as a series of reputations, now saw it as a continuum of repairs. She authorized scholarships in Gang's name. She asked Huo to be a partner in certain philanthropic ventures. The city, which had loved its scandals and its reconciliations with equal appetite, found in this a story it could put into papers and forget, but not completely. When the final chapter of personal healing came, it was years later, and it arrived precisely the way the rules of decency had demanded it would. Slowly, consensually, and as adults who had carried separate lives until the time they chose to join them. Zhenjiang had never been starved for attention. She had been hungry for competence and fairness. She had always wanted to be useful, and that desire had matured into a vocation. She became a woman who could argue the case for a worker's lodging, and for the paperwork that made such lodging possible. She also had quiet pleasures. A garden with herbs, an old charm cupped on her dresser, the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. Jiu Yifan had become a man who carried the language of responsibility in his jaw. He had learned to negotiate with the world not from a place of entitlement, but from a place of service. He had benevolence partnered with a mind like a scalpel. When he spoke in boardrooms, he did so while remembering the rooftop and the small hands that had protected him. They grew toward one another with the ease of long acquaintance. There were dinners in which they discovered the same preference for certain bitter teas and walks, where they traded stories from their different worlds. There were arguments, the kind that two people who care have, about risk, about the pace of change, about whether to open the company to more public investment. Each disagreement was an opportunity for trust. They learned to forgive and to keep their promises. When they finally stood together in public as equals, the ceremony was modest and elegant, no show of power, but an honest celebration of chosen union. Old Qi, older and steadier than ever, sat near the front and held Gengjing's hand, with the same iron comfort he had offered from the first day she left the paddy fields. Old Madame Guillou, who had once looked at the city like a chessboard of consequence, gave her blessing aloud with a smile that had weathered storms and found its bearings. Lin Jiajia did not attend. Those who had been opposed had either receded or been reconciled in ways that kept their heads low. The Zhang family's representatives were present in the form of legal motions and a diminished presence. The Huo family sent representatives who balanced friendship and a kind of proud relief. They had watched the girl who had once chased men on a rooftop become a woman worthy of the house's honor. The small red ribbon reappeared in the celebration in the quietest of ways, tied to a bouquet, folded into a note, and finally woven into the lace that Gengjing chose to wear. The wooden charm that had once been small and weathered lay beside her vows, like a talisman of the life she had chosen to build. At their vows, Ye Fan did not speak with the speech of a man used to command. He spoke with the voice of someone who had been given a second chance at life and had chosen, carefully and daily, to be the better person. He spoke of gratitude, of how a small hand had led him back from danger and of a promise not to let the past be a manuscript of shame, but a prologue to a better future. Gengjing's vows were shorter and precise, the way a person raised to value action more than words tends to be. She promised to be a partner in stewardship, to continue the philanthropic programs she had helped establish, and to keep her wooden charm in a place of honor. She did not romanticize the hardships ahead. She simply promised to be honest. They sealed their promises with a ring and a quiet kiss, and the house breathed again as if a window had been opened. After the ceremony, in the small hush between applause and the cutting of cake, Gengjing stepped outside and held the wooden charm against the moonlight. Old Qi, who had been given the honor of walking her part of the way, watched her with eyes that still had the softness of the river on his face. "You carried the river with you," he said. "You kept its patience." She smiled. "And it kept me." Their lives moved forward neither charmed by power, nor seduced by it. The company flourished under the governance Yifan and his team built, and the Jiu family's name was no longer a fragile thing, but a house that had been repaired with deliberate care. Gengjing continued to run initiatives for villages, ensuring there were water pumps, clinics, and scholarships. Her work was not a trophy, but a craft. The story that began with a 5-year-old sliding off a tram into a big city ended with a woman who had shaped a life by principle. Courage does not need size to be meaningful. Loyalty does not need wealth to be steadfast, and truth, when pursued patiently and with help from those willing to risk, can ride a course that greedy hands attempted to bend. On a quiet evening, years after the rooftop rescue, Gengjing walked across the mansion's roof. Lanterns were strung, not for a feast, but for the simple pleasure of seeing light against the city's skyline. She touched the railing and thought of a small child who had once stood at the same place, her hair ribbon crooked, and her bag too big for her shoulders. She smiled at the memory, and then looked down at the city lights that had once been a map of foreignness, and now felt like a living thing she could help. Jiu Yifan came to stand beside her. He did not need to say much. They had been through conspiracies and courtrooms, poison and ambush, and the slow work of learning to trust each other's steadiness. He took her hand, and for a moment, they were simply two people, holding on to the truth, and onto each other. "If I had not met you on that roof," he said, quietly, "I don't know who I would be." "You would have been fine," she teased, but her voice held the warmth of someone who knew better. "Just bored." He laughed, properly this time. And for both of them, the sound folded the past into a manageable place. They had built a life on choices, on allies, who used their power to protect, rather than exploit, and on the small, indestructible courage, of a person, who would not look away. If you loved Cheng Cheng's courage, like and subscribe for more true underdog stories.